Spoilers ahead. Watch out, and take care. The movie begins with Chris Pratt, driving with his headlights off along a country highway, to show his girlfriend Kelly and another couple the swarms of fireflies lit up in the summer night. After a while, his friends ask him to turn on the headlights, but Chris does not listen. Unfortunately, Chris crashes his convertible into a broken-down combine on the road. Chris and Kelly survive, but the other two do not. 4 years later, we learn Chris's injuries include brain damage that affects his short-term memory, in the form of anterograde amnesia, as well as some anger management problems. He wakes up every morning and follows the same routine, that he always writes down on a piece of paper. He attends classes to learn new skills, including the simple sequence of daily tasks to compensate for his inability to remember, and keeps notes for himself in a small notebook. While sitting near a skating rink, he notices Kelly walking by, but the two do not speak to each other. Later, Chris meets with his psychologist, Janet, who takes an interest in his health. Janet realizes that he is lonely, because he has no friends or girlfriend. He proposes they go out together and then sleep at his place, but she is embarrassed. Janet is not offended, because she knows that he does not always mean what he says. Finally, she tells him that she only wants to help him achieve his goals. In fact, she challenges him to build a life for himself despite his injuries. In the evening, Chris returns home, where he finds a phone message from his blind friend Lewis, who has made him dinner. After finishing work, Lewis returns home and makes dinner for the two of them. He is Chris's only friend who supports him emotionally and talks to him. Later, Chris goes to work, cleaning at a provincial bank. He aspires to become a teller, but the bank manager, Mr. Tuttle, can barely conceal his disdain for Chris's ambitions. As Chris pulls up the floors, he happily remembers the times when he played field hockey, before the accident. It is on this night that Chris comes under the eyes of a gang planning to rob the bank. After finishing work, Chris goes to a pub, where he has a non-alcohol beer. The robbery gang leader, Gary, who has known Chris since high school, and resented his wealth and popularity as a field hockey star before the incident, befriends him and uses a young woman, Lovely, to seduce him. To bond with him, Gary confesses he also has a health problem, asthma. Contrary to what was expected, Gary proves to be very friendly. In addition, he saves Chris from the bartender, who wanted to charge him $20 for a beer. The next day, Chris decides to go celebrate Thanksgiving together with his wealthy family, taking Lewis with him. During the dinner, it quickly becomes clear that Chris's family has never committed to supporting him emotionally. They are too busy with their own lives and affairs. After dinner, he talks to his sister and asks her if she remembers a certain Gary from school, but she denies it. He plays chess with his father, but because of his health situation, he cannot play like he used to, and gives up. His father resents this, and Chris decides it is time to leave. As they drive home, Lewis tells him he should never go back to his family, because they do not appreciate him. A few nights later, while Chris is at work, the sheriff, a friend, drops by to give him donuts. Chris returns to the pub, where he meets Gary and his friends again. Lovely approaches him, and they start talking. He is a little embarrassed and keeps forgetting her name, but she is patient. At the end of the evening, Lovely invites him to come over to their house. While Gary is having fun with a girl in a room, Lovely stays with Chris. She reveals they are going to party out of town tomorrow, and invites him. As he sometimes says things without being able to restrain himself, and he says he would like to see her naked. She grabs his hand and places it on her thigh. She begins to seduce him, kissing him, and they spend the night together. Gary then takes Chris home, and seeing what a poor neighborhood he lives in, he tells him he deserves a better life. Chris enters the house and is greeted by Lewis, and when told what he did today, Lewis begins to be suspicious of Lovely and Gary. The next day, Chris goes to the ranch, where he meets Gary and everyone else. Initially, everyone drinks and has a good time. Chris falls asleep, and wakes up a few hours later. He goes to the basement, where he meets the others. Here Gary starts telling him about the plans he has laid out on the wall, bank robberies. When Chris realizes he really intends to rob banks, he is startled. However, Gary explains his plan is to rob rich people's money, and give it to farmers. Gary has chosen Chris because he wants to rob the very bank where he is cleaning. Chris is initially teased by the gang about the limitations of his life after the incident. Then Gary talks to him about power, and how important it is to have it. However, the only way to have it is to have money. Also, Gary points out that Chris has no power because his father pays for all his things, so he is nobody. Chris remains silent and is about to leave, but then decides to spend the night with Lovely. The next morning, he leaves while Lovely and Gary watch him through the window. Chris and Lewis go to the bank to apply for a loan, to open a diner. However, the bank employee does not seem inclined to give the loan, and Chris does not seem enthusiastic about the idea. In the following days, he repeats the same routine over and over again, and begins to get annoyed. One evening, he calls his father to ask him for a sum of money to start his own business, but as he expected, his father refuses. Here, he realizes Gary was right, he has no power, so he decides to join the gang. Over the next few days, he helps the gang with preparations for the robbery. He also takes pictures of the vault, and when he is caught by his friend the sheriff, he claims they are pictures for his parents. Afterwards, the gang lays out the plan, and Gary entrusts Chris with the task of distracting the security guard. One night, Chris returns home with Lovely, while Lewis is still awake. While Chris is asleep, Lovely goes to the kitchen, and is surprised by Lewis. Chris's friend is not as naive as he is, so he immediately starts asking various questions about Lovely's name. He is certain that Gary and Lovely are made-up names, and worries about what might happen to Chris. She tries to seem friendly, but Lewis is not easily fooled, and asks why she came here tonight, but receives no answer. A few days later, a large amount of money is brought to the bank where Chris works, and he informs Gary of this. That night, the sheriff arrives as usual, to bring donuts to Chris, who tells him he doesn't need his help to buy donuts. The sheriff leaves, confused and offended. The next day, while Chris and his friend are having lunch, Lewis realizes Chris is acting strange and agitated. In addition, Chris informs him he will soon be moving out, outraging Lewis. Later in the evening, after Chris arrives at work, his boss points out he has noticed a change in his dressing and behavior. The man informs him that he has pleasantly surprised him, and invites him to his office the next day to talk about his promotion. Chris realizes he is doing the wrong thing. He immediately calls Lewis and says he needs help, he has made a mistake. Lewis promises him he will arrive in an hour and help him. When the gang arrives the night of the robbery, Chris tells them he has changed his mind. However, Gary punches him, and tells him to follow the plan, because it is too late. The gang members take their positions, and start drilling a hole in the vault to get at the money. A little later, the sheriff arrives, and everyone but Chris goes into hiding. Gary tells him to let him leave without suspecting anything. The sheriff stopped only to inform Chris that the next week his wife is due to give birth to their first child. Chris apologizes to his friend for how he spoke to him last evening, and the sheriff leaves, accepting his apology. Afterwards, the gang continues their work. When they finally make the hole to get to the vault, Gary forces Chris to empty the vault at gunpoint. Chris obeys and begins emptying the vault. Once the bags full of money are filled, they are carried into the car. At this point, the sheriff is returning to the bank with donuts. The sheriff knocks on the door and calls Chris, but no one answers. His friend Ted, the sheriff's deputy, stumbles upon the robbery while delivering the donuts to Chris, and triggers a shootout. After a long shootout, the deputy and two gang members, Marty and Cork, are killed. Meanwhile, Chris escapes outside, and gets into the robber's car, inside which is the money. In the process, Gary is seriously injured, and manages to escape with the other robber, Bone. Chris realizes he has the stolen money while he is already driving. Suddenly, he is stopped by a police officer, who spotted him driving without headlights. The officer finds Chris's note, informing him of his mental situation, and lets him go. He compulsively returns to the scene of the accident, where he buries the money on the side of the road. When he returns to his apartment, he sees the lights on, and realizes something is wrong. When he calls, he finds Gary and Bone have taken Lewis hostage to get the money back. Chris returns to his parents' house while they are asleep, and using his new sequencing skills, devises a plan to stay alive and save his friend. He takes his father's weapons and leaves. The next day, he calls Gary, and arranges to meet him at a place where they will make an exchange. They will give him Lewis for the money. However, the robbers catch him dozing at the place where they had arranged to meet, and force him to take them to the site of the buried money. As Chris digs in the snow to retrieve the money, Gary's condition deteriorates rapidly. Chris delivers one of the two bags to Bone, who prepares to execute Lewis. Suddenly, Chris uses the shotgun hidden in the other bag to shoot and kill Bone before he can react. Gary keels over and dies. Chris returns the money, and turns himself in, but the FBI investigation concludes that he is not responsible because of his condition, and because the robbers did not disconnect the bank's video surveillance, allowing them to see the gang forcing Chris to act at gunpoint. Later, Chris and Lewis reconcile, and open a restaurant together with a loan from the bank. Chris hopes that Kelly will forgive him for the loss of his leg in the accident, and that one day he will find the courage to talk to her again. The end. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. Turn on the notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out.